Hello, everyone. My name is Saber Jlassi. I'm a freelance VFX artist and a Houdini instructor. And today I'm going to be talking about procedural rock formations in Houdini for Unreal Engine 4 for games and for VFX as well. And this is a part of a workshop that I'm working on. It's a 10 weeks workshop that will focus on advanced asset creation in Houdini. And today I'm going to show a part of the workshop, which is the procedural creation of the assets. So I'm going to start by showing some references of the things that I'm going to be looking at to try and recreate that procedurally. And I have a few images here. You can see there's this mountain here, there's this cliff. And then there's these two images, which are a generic type of cliffs and rocks formations and things like that. And if I take these images and put them in black and white just to look at the lines and the values, what the eye is really looking for is a change in a sudden change in contrast and a dark edge, a black lines. And this is what we see in all these images, especially this one here and this one. You can see there is a sudden change of contrast, which means depth change along the height, the width, and various things. And then there is a sharp lines, which are basically the cracks of the rocks. And these cracks can continue from top to bottom if you have a big cliff, or they can stop and then start somewhere else. And so cracks doesn't have to be continuous. And so these are the main elements that the eye, I think, will be looking for to say, this is a rock, this is a cliff, this is a big cliff. And the other aspect of these rock formation is, if you want to cell scale, the first thing that you need to add is the variation in terms of details. So you would have a big cliff that has a flat surface, and along with that, there is a lot of medium-sized details and a small-sized details. And then with that visual information, the eye can judge the scale without having any other reference in the environment, like a human or a tree or something like that. So I'm going to try and see what ways we can achieve this in Houdini, how we can create this kind of geometry procedurally. So the first thing that comes to mind is to take, is to use noise. And the first one that comes to mind is the whirly noise. And if you take the F2 minus F1, this is the whirly noise in Houdini, and you subtract the two, you get this nice pattern. And instead of using the position, the raw position, I'm adding a little bit of noise to that, so it creates a little bit of breakup. You can see that it works great on a surface, on a flat surface. And I can use this to create rocks and then add another level with big rocks, and then maybe use the height to flatten some details and things like that. So this is very simple. You can see the graph is very straightforward. But this works on a flat plane. If you try this on a very complex geometry, it fails quickly, because what happens is we're pushing details. We're pushing the geometry along the normals. And so those edges of the box here, they will have a few polygons, but then they get pushed too far. So you get issues with the geometry, as well as if we have a concave mesh, and we're pushing details from this side and this side, there will be a lot of collision. So there will be a lot of collision that we cannot fix with geometry. So there is so much that we can do with geometry to solve this problem. And the solution that we have in Houdini to do this kind of stuff is to use volume. So instead of operating on the mesh, on points, we're going to use volume. So in this example, I have a sphere. And you can see that this is the domain. And Houdini can take any geometry and converts it into a volume. In this case, it's a Vdb volume, and this is the format. I'm then taking this sphere here, and I'm adding noise to it. And the way we add noise to volume fields is by running a volume sample, which is a very simple operation in volume VOPs. And instead of having this domain sample, let's say this point, instead of it sampling that point, we tell it to look for something else in another different place, and that's what the noise will add. So this point here, for example, will look up a value here, and then instead of this point, it will look up for something else that has a different density. And so we can start breaking this volume And once we have that, we can do the same thing on an SDF. Oh, come on. Okay, so this is, I need this video. Oh, 1 second, sorry about that. So this is a first example, and instead of, something happened, yeah. So instead of using the volume that I showed you, I'm using an SDF, which is a surface distance field, and it's basically a volume. Let's think of it as a volume, but it gives us the luxury of looking at a volume like a surface. Instead of it being a transparent volume, we can see it as an actual surface. And this box here is a volume, it's an SDF. And I can start adding the Worley noise that I showed you guys in the beginning, but instead of adding it to the surface, I'm gonna add it to the volume. And by just doing that, you can see that we start to add details. We can actually push rocks out, push details out of the volume. And they will, if you have it as a volume, it will solve all the collision issues, and you will not have any problems with normals because there is none. So you can push details from anywhere, and it will just work. You can take any complex geometry and convert it into volume, and then use this Worley to add rocks details onto anything. And so this is an example of me just pushing the noise too far. And you can see as I reach the boundaries, I start getting artifacts. So I need to expand the domain of this. So it's just a volume, basically. And so the next example is the same, with just a slight modification. So this is another box with the Worley added, and then I'm adding more noise, fine noise, to the Worley itself, to the noise pattern. So it breaks up those edges, and you can see we have all kinds of details that we can get into any surface that we want. So this is great. This is a very promising approach. With a couple of nodes, we can take any geometry and add rocks to it. So this is how the graph looks like for the volume sample. You can see this is the final result that goes into the volume sample node. It's another node. I just removed it to save space. And I'm adding a couple of noise here to the position, the scale of the Worley size, to just add a little bit of variation so it's not uniform. And this is another example of just that same deformer with played with the noise a little bit more. And you can see what kind of details we can get. This is a sphere with just one deformer, with the volume that we wrote. You can see we have already rocks from our sphere. Cool, so the next thing is how we can take and make realistic cliffs out of this deck. Sorry, cool. So I'm gonna show the final result, and then I'll explain how I did this. So this is the final mesh out of Houdini, and this is entirely procedurally created along with the textures as well. So the main problem when you start exploring various techniques in doing rocks in Houdini, you will have a big problem, which is creating cracks. And the other thing is creating the silhouette of your cliff or your element. And the easiest way, the best way to do this, I found, is to actually model that geometry, is to create it in Houdini with the cracks in there, and then take it to a volume, convert it into a volume, and then add the extra details in there. So my approach is to, I'm going to show the final mesh here for a second, and then I'll show how I've done it. So this is the final surface, and it's a high-res rock that has about 7 million polygons, and this is 100% procedural. And you can see it has all kinds of details with the fine details, big details. You have the cliffs, you have the variation in depth, you have the cracks, and you have all the elements that needs. And the fact that we can say this is a rock from just looking at it is a gray shaded is a great thing to have, because that means that we're heading in the right direction. And one fun thing that happened, which is very hard to sculpt these details, is you can get concaves, you can get holes because of the noise, the way that it works. It can push details out, but not in the same way. So you can create holes, and this happened here. It's going to give me a nightmare to UV, of course, later, but it's very cool, and it's hard to sculpt these kind of details by hand. And so this is the final result, and this is the approach. I start off with a box, and I use the Voronoi fracture to basically break it up into chunks, into rock-like geometry. And then I take the outer pieces of that box and I delete it. I delete everything that is in the surrounding. And then the interior of the box, of the Voronoi, will have a very interesting depth variation. It will have all the basic details that we need for our cliff. And then to add another level of complexity, I isolate certain pieces here and I fracture them again to add a variation in the size of the cracks. So this group is fractured again, and then I deleted a little bit of pieces here just to randomize it, and then I merged it back into the original. So this is my base, and this is very, very simple in Houdini to do. And by the way, I wanted to mention that this workshop, it has a lot of stuff, and part of it is the creation of the rocks and cliffs. It has no scripting, there is no programming, and you don't have to know anything about Vex or anything. And everything was done using Houdini Escape. So you don't need the full Houdini version if you wanted to do all of this. So the next thing is I wanted to take that original mesh, and before I take it into a volume, I wanted to deform those cracks, because right now they're very specific lines because of the Voronoi. So we do a technique called edge displacement, which basically takes we take the flat polygon, we compute the tangent, and then push along that tangent. And so we can deform the surface without changing the silhouette. We just add details in the cracks. And then here you can see there is a lot of pieces here. I just picked some and removed them by hand. And here I'm using pack primitives. So this is a pack primitive, and I can grab in the viewport. I can select the pieces that I want to remove and check them out to create more breakups. I can also select pieces and treat them, add something to them, and then put them back. And so this is the original mesh, and then I convert that into an SDF, which is a volume, basically. And this is the actual representation from the viewport in Houdini with the volume. And then this SDF is then run through the noise operation that I showed, mixed with various other noise, just to add a little bit more breakup. And that's the final surface. That's it. There's nothing added after that. And this is the final high-res mesh. And of course, we can take this high-res, create a low-res, and generate the maps for it, which we're going to show in a second. So because we have everything procedural and working, I can generate hundreds of thousands of these without any issues. So just for this presentation, I randomized the seed of the Voronoi points that I used for the fracturing. And these are different versions that I've created in like 20 minutes just for waiting for the network to cook. And because I used a lot of voxels, it takes about 5 minutes. So this is the first version which I showed. It's about, I think, 8 million poly. And you can, of course, generate low-res versions without any issues by changing the voxel count, and the details won't change. It will get blurrier and blurrier every time. So this is one version. This is another one. And I didn't change, again, just the randomization of the point. And you can see you get different details. This is another version. And people would ask me, like, we lose the flexibility of the artistic stuff. Well, if you have a reference that you need to reproduce exactly as it is, go photoscan it. You have it, go photoscan it. Don't try to resculpt it. If you have a specific crack that you need to paint or sculpt and have a director sitting next to you, use a 3D sculpting. But if you need hundreds of thousands of rocks that you then would like to look at some of them and say, I want this is the tool to use. So I can generate hundreds of thousands, do turntable, do renders, and then show it to the art director and say which one you like. I'll grab 10. We use those 10 in the pipeline. So this is the flexibility that this workflow gives you, and there is just so many things that we can do. I'm going to continue. So these are just some variation. You can see every time it picks a different pieces to delete and stuff like that. And you can see the cracks that I was talking about. Basically the variation in depth. We can see there's a lot of push and pull. There's a lot of fine cracks. There is a lot of cavity, which is a big thing, and very hard to sculpt as well to get these kind of cavities and have details on them. So these are more variation, and it's endless. I can run this forever and put it on TurboSquid and sell it. So yeah, I think I've done. This is a little bit more variation with the same workflow, but I tried to use different techniques. For example, could be used for an alien-like creature or something, or an environment asset for an alien-like design. This is just copying different Voronoi pieces into a tube, basically, and having them pointing this way, and then adding noise. These guys are the same as this. I just deleted more pieces. Instead of having delete just the outer layer, I deleted more pieces, so it gave me these kind of sharp details. This is the same, just deleting random pieces. And you can see how flexible the workflow is and again, I can randomize this a lot. So we're gonna take this one step further. We wanna do this type of stuff. And this is, again, 100% procedurally generated in Houdini. The texture is a real texture, but later in the course, we'll have it fully procedural. So we're gonna look at how we can do this type of stuff, which I think has everything that a realistic cliff would have. And this element looks very in a specific way if you have the peaks point downward versus upwards. It's just a visual illusion, but I've used it in two different ways, and we'll show you guys. So these are just still images from the cliff. And I'm gonna look at the approach. So it's the same thing. Instead of starting with that specific box, I started with this one, which has it's a little bit elongated, and then I Voronoi that, add edge displacement to break it up, and then I basically pick pieces that I like from inside. So these are just pieces from inside, and then this is from the other side. I think from the top, just basically two sides that are flat, and then I combine those. So I have these two guys are meeting at flat edges. And this is my start geometry. And then all I do to it is, this is the base geo, convert it into an SDF, add the noise. And everything will just work. Now, with this noise, it's a little bit more advanced. And the Worley or the Voronoi noise, that gives you a seed number. And that seed means you can randomize. It gives you basically a unique number per block. So if you have a grid and there's cells for the Worley, you can get randomized color. And I use that information to vary how much it pushes. So with the noise and everything, I get these interesting cracks. And it will also cause a sharp change in depth, because one block will push a lot of details out, and another part will get pushed in. So I'll get a lot of push and pull. And also, if the detail is pushed too much, it will create a gap in between in some parts. So we'll see that as well. And again, this is very simple networks in Houdini, and there is no scripting. This is a turntable of the cliff rendered. I've copied it a few times and rotated it, and basically it did render. So this is how it looks like. And this is the final geo. I think it's about 4 million polygons. And again, the resolution is not really important. It's just how much details you would need in the mesh. Cool. So let's see. So the next example is this. I took the same approach. Instead of using that box, I picked another one. I did 2 boxes this time, one at the top, one at the bottom, and I deleted pieces from the outer layer. So these I removed stuff, and then same thing here, and then I added the noise. That's all about it, that you convert it into a volume, and then you add the noise. You can add actually stones, and you do volume processing, which I will show. You can actually push details further if you need to. There is so many data that we can use to add any kinds of information we want in the visual. So if you if you wanted to add pebbles, if you wanted to analyze this volume and place specific pieces based on the cavity or things like that, you can definitely do that. So this is one piece, the front and back. And then all these assets together, we're going to build an environment with them, and I will show you. This is another piece. I started with 3 boxes and deformed them a little bit, and then started doing the Voronoi fracturing and adding the volume deformation. Now the volume here is a little bit different. I used more push and pull with the Voronoi, so I used the seed and pushed the volume in and out a bit more to get this complexity. Cool, so the next element is very similar, but instead of starting with a box, I started with multiple grids, and then each one of them I Voronoid it in a specific way, so it has different cuts, and then I extruded that. And then I run the same volume operation on it. And for this logo, because it's a volume field, I can generate any other volume fields and do operation. I can subtract volume, and this is very, very precise. Like it's very fast and very precise. So you can actually delete chunks from here and change them with other materials. You can remove whole section of this and add, for example, a destroyed wall or a destroyed details or beams coming out of it, and it's super, super easy to do. So the next one is the same version with just less deformation. So this is just a little bit of push and pull, and you can see how these details are coming out. This detail, the base geometry is very simple for this, but then with the volume processing, there's a lot that gets added to it. This is another one, and again, it's procedural. So this is 100 versions that I run with just changing the noise, and I did render them, and then I can show this and to whomever needs to decide, and they can say, okay, I like this piece, I like this variation. You can see here, for example, the variation and the chunk size is changing as well. So, and there is just very little variation that I'm changing in the graph, and let it cook for the night. I think this 100 versions, very high res, 4 million each, took about 6 hours to finish, and they're very high res meshes. So it will continue. There's a lot, so you can use that. And then, so once we have all these assets, we can then take them to VFX. Like if you want to render them in Mantra or anything, that you can use the high-res mesh. But for games, we need to generate the low-res version. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take the cliff. This is actually the one that I mentioned. It's pointing downward. It's now pointing upward. And then I converted that into a Vdb. So the final mesh, I generated a volume from it, and then I used that volume to generate a low-res mesh. And this is very easy to do in Houdini. So this is a low-res mesh. I think it's about 20K. And then with using Mantra, we can bake textures. So sorry, before we get to the texture baking, I need to generate UVs. So there is many ways you can do this in Houdini. You can use the nearest point and select specific edges that you use to unwarp the mesh. But in this case, I wanted to set up something automatic. So in Houdini, there is a node that can cluster a point cloud. So you can give it a mesh and say, I want to cluster it. And it will try to group each set of points into a group by themselves. So in here, this is the original mesh. I give it 6 points going from top to bottom and 3 points going this way. So it's 9 points. And it gave me back 9 clusters. So these are my clusters. And then what I do is I find the edge of each cluster. So I loop over each cluster and say, okay, what's the edge? What's the limits? And then this is the limit of each cluster. I then copy that back into the mesh and use it to select the edges. So I now have a selection that groups each group of polygons together, and I can use that to unwarp the mesh. This requires a little bit of interactive, so you have to look at the UVs to make sure that there is no issues. And this is basically what I was able to get out of the box. And this graph can work with any kinds of geometry. The next thing is, so now that we have UVs, we can basically take this high res, low res, and high res, and bake the maps that we need. So this is occlusion, normal maps, cavity maps, vector displacement, cavities, thickness, P and N, things like. So you can bake anything. You can add custom AUVs if you want to as well. And then I took that for Unreal. So this is the low-res mesh front and back. And then I applied the normal map that I generated. And this is with the normal map applied. And then this is a graph in Houdini and Unreal Engine. So I have a texture here. I'm using the triplanar texturing. And then this is the normal maps, and I use the occlusion maps. And I've went through multiple assets. So I did that cliff that I showed at the beginning. I did the wall. I deformed it to become circular. I created another element for the ground. And then this is the final version. So let me open it in high res instead. So this is running in Unreal. It's it's 4 assets only, and this big wall here is the one I showed front and back, and I bended it, and I just baked the maps for all of them, imported them in Unreal, and started putting things together. So this is one environment, and this is the cliff, the sharp cliff that I showed. Here it's pointing upward, here it's pointing downward. And this is all running in 60 FPS. I am not a real-time expert, so this is the first time I've used Unreal. It's running 60 FPS on a 680 GTX, and I just added some lights, and it was a fun experience. So this is another element. I used similar techniques, and I think it was much simpler to create that. I didn't have to do a lot of noise. It just created a circle, added noise, and then rotated that and copied it back. And this is the environment, and everything has UVs on it, textured. All was done in Houdini, and this is one other thing that I wanted with this course. I didn't want to use any other package. I want everything to be done in Houdini. And these textures are actually procedurally generated in Houdini using Houdini cops. So everything was done in Houdini. And we'll go over all the details in the workshop, hopefully. So this is the Unreal Engine, and I'm going to show this version is rendered in Arnold. I didn't use any normal displacement or anything, and it's using the high-res mesh. So it's about 28 million polygons without instancing, and the final count is like 900 billions. And this is all rendered together. Like there is no compositing, there is no displacement. Everything is with actual mesh. And these are all the elements I pretty much showed here. These are the cliffs. And there is this one that I showed as well, which is a different variation. And then I did another version. So this is another version with atmosphere. Cool. So I wanted to show two more things that I've done after the slide is done. So I wanted to show high-res renders of, how can I get zoom in? Okay. Yes. So these are this is the cliff that I showed, the first one. And this texture is created in Houdini as well. So 100% Houdini, and the render was done in Mantra. And there's no displacement I didn't generate. I used the high-res mesh. You can see all kinds of details here. This is one. You can see this crack here, for example. And these are the pieces where I deleted to create more details. And there is just so much detail here. And there is a little bit of bump mapping, but there is no displacement or anything. And all these details are coming in the textures as well. So this is one element that I liked. This is another one with just a different shading here. And then, let's see. This is the wall, and I think it was not very obvious the amount of details, but this is the close-up of the actual render. You can see how much details there is. And then this is another one I didn't show in the presentation, but it uses very similar techniques. It's just I pushed the noise a little bit more to give me more of these, you know, the kind of rocks that you can find next to the shore with the cavities and these kind of cracks and things like that. And this is, again, a straight render out of Arnold with a high-res mesh. And then the last one is that wall, but shaded using procedural textures. And let me show the, I'm trying to get 100% so I don't show, I don't know how. So this is the amount of details that we have. And there is no displacement here. It's all in the mesh. There is only texture, procedural texture and bump applied to the mesh. Cool. Let's see. Cool, I showed this. I wanted to thank these guys, Igor Zanik, Andreas Bystrom, Urban Bradesco, Magnus Larsson, Bronik Budranek, Johnny Farmville, Side Effects, and Soliangle for all the help and support during the making of this workshop, which I'm still working on, but hopefully you guys have an idea of what the content is about. If you guys have any questions, please feel free to ask. Questions? I'm gonna try.
There we go. Teamwork. So with your procedural texture, it looked like it was taking into account actual topology from the mesh. Was that the case? That, like, was it?
No, it's a 2D texture, and it's I have a system that can make any texture tileable. And then I use tree planner, which basically it uses the normals of the mesh to create the UV coordinate on the fly. In some other cases, I had proper UV, so I can use the UVs. I use the curvature of the mesh to mix in a little bit of details, but that's about it. Cool. Any other questions?
With those holes and stuff, did you have problems with the UV?
Absolutely. Yes. So.
Did the system work with that?
Yeah. So you can. What you can do is you can click on the edge, Shift A, and then hold Shift A, and you can pick a target, and it will find the nearest path, give you an edge selection. There is a tool by Louis Skriel that helps with creating selections like this, and you have to find, basically do an edge selection by hand in there. You can try with the method that I showed to cluster and make sure that that piece gets a proper group so it unwarps correctly. But again, it's only a small section, and most of the techniques I used worked in the UVing process. Sure.
Did you try like 3D textures, so you didn't have to do like UV unwrapping, or?
Yeah, I did. I used the tree planner, which basically doesn't require a UV, so it can map the textures to the geometry directly.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
What's it
But
called?
for
tree
planner,
Okay.
yeah. But for games, I need the UVs because I need to bake that.
Right.
I need the information to bake the textures into.
Okay, cool.
Sure.
The part where you did the vulnerable fracture,
Uh-huh.
and you remove like the shell or the outer part.
Yeah.
Do you do it by hand selection, or do you have some procedural way?
No, so the box is like this. I have another delete node that has box with the box region. So I just scaled it to only select the stuff inside, and then it deletes everything else.
The parameter to shrink it.
Exactly. Yeah, you can change that to fit. I didn't go and try to make everything procedural because my goal was to get specific assets done. But there's so many controls that you can add to make the system 100% procedural, and you can stretch the box and it will give you a wall. you can squeeze it and it will give you a cliff, a sharp cliff and something like that. So there's a lot of flexibility. Yeah.
I was wondering if you could describe a little bit of the workflow, if there's more of like an established workflow for the edge displacement. That's one that seems like there's been a lot of kind of batting around of ideas around.
So, so my method is very simple. I have, especially with the Voron, I prefer to do it best on simple geometry. So you have the Voron OE pieces, you have the inside edge, and they have the exterior edge. Each of these faces have a normal. The exterior, I take the tangent, compute the tangent, and that's the vector. I will push the normals. And then I take the interior parts and I transfer the normals. So the exterior pieces would transfer their normal back into the interior faces. So it will, by distance, basically, each one will get the proper tangent that it needs to go towards. And that's it. Yeah. The other problem is to do the UVs, to fix the UVs. I didn't have to worry about that. Cool. Do you guys have any other questions? Sure.
So with box, you gotta use the box.
Throw it.
So with resampling from noise, I noticed in some cases you can get like where it's little things floating outside.
Yes.
How do you
course.
get rid of those?
Yeah. So you put down an assemble node, which will assemble all the pieces by connectivity, and then you can compute the volume of all the pieces, find the biggest, and delete everything else. So because the biggest will be your piece, or you can select it in the viewport and say, I want to keep this, delete everything else. Yeah, so that's how I would do it. Cool, okay. Well, thanks everyone for coming.